The November wind snaked through the ancient tombstones of Havenwood Cemetery, carrying a chill and an unspoken sorrow. The sky, a somber gray canvas, draped the small southern town in an unusual cloak of melancholy. Today, Havenwood was bidding farewell to one of its own, Sergeant Marcus Cole, an old soldier who bore the weight of history and the unhealing scars of the Vietnam War. He wasn't a politician or a celebrity, but to the African-American community here, and to many other veterans, he was a symbol. A beacon of courage and dignity. The air was thick with solemnity, the soft sobs of elderly women dressed in black, the attemptedly stifled coughs of men who had once faced life and death together, now helpless before the harshness of time. The honor guard, in their immaculate dress uniforms, performed the flag-folding ceremony with slow, reverent movements. Each fold seemed to enfold a lifetime, a sacrifice, an indelible memory. The flag, once perfectly triangulated, was placed respectfully on the oak casket, where Sergeant Cole lay in rest. Amidst the quiet crowd, a lone figure emerged from the main gate of the cemetery. She didn't hurry, her steps light yet firm on the browning grass. It was Captain Anya Sharma. Her olive-green army uniform, though not new, was impeccably pressed, a surprising splash of color amidst the sea of dark attire. She was around 45, tall and upright, her dark hair neatly pulled back in a bun, revealing an intelligent forehead and calm, deep brown eyes. Her features, though bearing the sharp lines of her South Asian heritage, exuded a quiet composure and a profound private grief. She carried no flowers, nor did she try to draw attention, yet her presence, like a stone dropped into a still pond, immediately sent ripples of curiosity, and even some less than friendly scrutinizing glances from a few in the crowd. She simply found a spot at a distance, her eyes fixed on Sergeant Cole's portrait, placed solemnly near the coffin. At the edge of the mourners, near an old oak tree, a burly man stood with his arms crossed. That was Sheriff Dale Harding. He was the embodiment of local authority in Havenwood. His confidence bordered on arrogance, his beer belly protruded slightly beneath his police shirt, and he had a relentless habit of chewing gum. Aviator sunglasses, Shuchang Yingxiao and Diwai. Advertising concealed much of his expression, but the way his lips curled slightly as he saw Captain Sharma, and the way his hand occasionally patted the holstered pistol slung low on his hip, spoke volumes. Harding squinted, sizing up the unfamiliar woman from head to toe. In his eyes, Sharma's appearance, a stranger in uniform, in a small town like Havenwood, was inherently suspicious, an unwelcome disruption to the order he so diligently maintained. Tension began to seep into the air, invisible yet palpable. The young black boy, perhaps Sergeant Cole's grandson, clutched a bouquet of white lilies, his wide, innocent eyes looking towards the woman in the green uniform. A few old soldiers subtly turned their heads, exchanging puzzled glances. Sheriff Harding began to stir. He cleared his throat, then slowly detached himself from the oak tree, advancing towards Captain Sharma. Each of Harding's steps on the damp grass seemed heavier, carrying an ominous premonition. He didn't walk fast, but each step was deliberate, like a predator approaching its prey. No one spoke, but the silence was no longer reverent. It was now tinged with anticipation, an anxious waiting for what was about to unfold. Would the sanctity of the ceremony remain intact, or was an undercurrent of storm about to break right here on this hallowed ground, where soldiers lay at rest? Sheriff Harding came to a stop directly in front of Captain Sharma, his bulk deliberately blocking her view of the ongoing ceremony. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, laced with an authority he clearly expected to be unchallenged. "Ma'am," he began, his tone a shade too casual for the solemnity of the occasion, "I don't recognize you. You got business here?" The words, though not overtly aggressive, hung in the air, a clear challenge, a demand for justification in a place where grief should have been the only currency. Captain Sharma did not immediately respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the flag-draped coffin, a silent tribute to Sergeant Cole. Her stillness was not one of submission, but of a deep, unshakable composure, a fortress of personal sorrow and unwavering respect. It was as if Harding and his pointed question were mere background noise to the profound connection she felt with the man being honored. Harding, unaccustomed to being ignored, especially by someone he deemed an outsider, felt a flicker of irritation. His jaw tightened. "This here is a private service, ma'am," he pressed, his voice a little louder now, a little sharper, scraping against the sacred quiet. "If you ain't family or invited, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The veiled threat was now an open one. He was drawing a line, asserting his dominance in his town, at his event as he saw it. Then, in a move that crossed an unspoken boundary, Harding took another step closer, his hand reaching out, his thick fingers, calloused and unwelcoming, made contact with the insignia on Captain Sharma's shoulder, a crude, almost invasive touch, as if he were physically testing the authenticity of her uniform, of her very presence. It was a blatant act of disrespect, a physical manifestation of his suspicion and disdain. A low growl rumbled from a nearby wheelchair. "Hey, Harding, leave her be." It was Doc Simmons, an old Army medic, a brother-in-arms to Sergeant Cole, his face a roadmap of hard-lived years and battles fought. His voice, though raspy with age and emotion, carried the weight of someone who had seen too much to be intimidated by a local sheriff's bluster. "This is hallowed ground, not your damn stage to be showing off your authority." Before Doc Simmons could say more, a younger deputy, eyes wide and a little nervous, quickly moved to his side, placing a placating hand on the old veteran's shoulder, a silent plea for him to stand down. It was only then, after the physical touch, after the public challenge, that Captain Sharma finally turned her head. Her eyes, the color of rich, dark earth, met Harding's. There was no fear in them, no anger, only a profound weariness and an unyielding resolve. Her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly even, devoid of any tremor. Yet each word landed with the precision and impact of a carefully aimed shot. "Sheriff," she stated, her tone a quiet counterpoint to his bluster, "you are overstepping your bounds." The simple, direct statement, delivered with such unnerving calm, seemed to momentarily stun Harding. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by a woman and definitely not by a woman of color in his town, regardless of the uniform she wore. His face, already ruddy, began to flush a deeper shade of crimson. He puffed out his chest, his hand instinctively dropping closer to the butt of his holstered gun. This was no longer just a question of protocol for him. It had become a personal affront, a test of his authority in front of his community, and he was not about to back down. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The mourners, who had been trying to maintain their focus on the somber proceedings, were now all too aware of the escalating confrontation, their grief momentarily overshadowed by a dawning sense of unease and a growing, collective indignation. The sanctity of the moment had been shattered, and a different kind of solemnity, one born of dread, began to take its place. Captain Sharma's quiet, firm words, "Sheriff, you are overstepping your bounds," acted not as a de-escalation, but as a lit match to Sheriff Harding's already smoldering fuse. To him, this was an intolerable act of defiance. In his mind, she was an interloper, an unknown woman of color in a uniform he didn't immediately recognize or respect, challenging his authority in his town, at a funeral he felt he was overseeing. The perceived slight to his ego, combined with a lifetime of ingrained biases, pushed him towards a dangerous precipice. His face, already flushed, darkened to a shade of angry purple. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle pulsed visibly beneath his ear. "Who in the hell do you think you are talking to me like that?" he finally exploded. His voice no longer a rumble but a full-throated roar that ripped through the respectful silence of the cemetery. "You don't look like you belong here." The accusation was raw, undisguised, a toxic cocktail of racial insinuation and a blatant questioning of her military standing. He wasn't just asking who she was. He was declaring she had no right to be there, no right to wear that uniform, no right to command any respect from him. Then, in a chilling escalation that sent a collective gasp through the assembled mourners, Harding's hand, which had been hovering near his sidearm, moved with a sudden, deliberate speed. There was a sickeningly sharp metallic click as he unsnapped the retaining strap of his holster. It was a sound that in any other context might have gone unnoticed. But here, in the hushed sanctity of a burial ground, under the heavy gaze of grieving veterans and tearful families, it was as loud and ominous as a thunderclap. He hadn't drawn the weapon fully, not yet, but his fingers were now wrapped firmly around the checkered grip, his index finger resting dangerously close to the trigger guard. The threat was no longer implied. It was stark, immediate, and terrifyingly real. The atmosphere in the cemetery, already thick with grief, now froze solid with a new, sharper kind of dread. The young boy clutching the lilies let out a choked cry, his small body trembling as he buried his face in his mother's skirt. The hushed whispers of the crowd died instantly, replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. Faces that had been etched with sorrow were now masks of disbelief and fear. One young soldier, barely out of his teens, instinctively lurched forward, his training kicking in, a primal urge to protect, to intervene. But an older, wiser hand from a fellow serviceman clamped down on his arm, a silent, urgent command to hold his ground, to not escalate the already volatile situation. Through it all, Captain Anya Sharma remained utterly still. Her gaze, unwavering, was not fixed on Harding's contorted face, nor on the faces of the shocked onlookers. It was fixed, with an almost preternatural calm, on the dark, menacing outline of the pistol still partially holstered at Harding's hip, on the potential for lethal force that it represented. There was no flicker of fear in her eyes, no hint of panic. Instead, there was an almost imperceptible sadness, a profound weariness, as if she had seen this scene play out, in one form or another, too many times before. And beneath that, a steely, almost heartbreaking acceptance of a grim, familiar reality. Her hand, hidden from Harding's view, moved slightly inside her uniform jacket pocket, her fingers closing around a small, smooth object, a worn river stone, a keepsake from Sergeant Cole, a silent reminder of the strength and dignity he had embodied, a strength she now drew upon in this moment of acute peril. The world seemed to hold its breath, teetering on the very edge of an irreversible tragedy, all because one man's prejudice had blinded him to the honor standing right before him. In that taut, breathless moment, as Sheriff Harding's finger twitched near the trigger, and the entire cemetery seemed poised on the brink of an unthinkable act, a voice, hesitant at first, but gaining strength, cut through the suffocating silence. That's General Sharma. Anya Sharma. The words came from the back of the crowd, from a young corporal, his face pale but his eyes wide with dawning recognition. He'd served a short tour at a forward operating base where General Sharma had once conducted a command inspection. He remembered her presence, her quiet authority, the way even the most seasoned officers had deferred to her. He'd never forgotten her face. It was as if a spell had been broken. The name, General Sharma, rippled through the mourners like an electric current. Whispers erupted, first tentative, then growing in volume and certainty. General Sharma? No, it couldn't be. It is her. I recognize her now, from the Kandahar briefings. The initial shock at Harding's aggression began to morph into a different kind of astonishment. In an instant, the digital age asserted itself. Smartphones, previously clutched in anxious hands or tucked away in pockets, were hastily pulled out. Fingers flew across screens, tapping in the name, searching, verifying. And then, the images began to flood in. Captain Anya Sharma, no, Major General Anya Sharma, a 2-star general in the United States Army. Photographs of her in full-dress uniform, adorned with rows of distinguished service medals, commendations for valor, leadership awards, articles detailing her command of complex joint task forces, her strategic acumen in hostile territories, her reputation as a soldier's soldier, respected and admired by those who had served under her and alongside her. The hashtag, General Sharma, almost instantaneously began to trend, first locally, then regionally, then with the viral velocity that only a truly shocking and compelling story can achieve. The transformation on Sheriff Harding's face was stark and immediate. The furious, apoplectic red drained away, replaced by a ghastly, chalky white. His eyes, moments before blazing with self-righteous anger, now darted around, wide and disbelieving, as he saw the glowing screens, heard the incredulous murmurs, felt the collective gaze of the crowd shift from fear of him to a dawning, horrified realization of his catastrophic misjudgment. The hand that had been so menacingly gripping his pistol began to tremble, not with rage, but with a sudden, sickening understanding of the magnitude of his error. The local, self-important authority he had so aggressively brandished moments ago now seemed pathetic, a flimsy, tattered shield against the undeniable truth that was unfolding before him. The power dynamic, so brutally asserted by him, had not just shifted. It had imploded spectacularly and irreversibly. And through it all, General Anya Sharma stood, a pillar of unyielding calm. She offered no correction, no confirmation. She didn't need to. The truth of who she was, the weight of her service, the honor she carried, had finally undeniably spoken for itself, amplified by 100 tiny screens and the dawning comprehension of a stunned community. The silence that followed was no longer one of fear, but of a profound collective awe and a dawning terrible shame for what they had just witnessed. The story of the general and the sheriff at the funeral exploded across the national consciousness with the ferocity of a wildfire. What began as hushed whispers and frantic smartphone searches in Havenwood Cemetery quickly escalated into a full-blown media sensation. Local news affiliates, initially alerted by citizen journalists uploading shaky phone footage, scrambled to get crews on site. By late afternoon, national news networks, initially hesitant to run with uncorroborated social media buzz, were forced to acknowledge the rapidly developing story as verified details about Major General Anya Sharma's distinguished career began to surface from official and unofficial military sources. The internet became a battleground of opinion. Waves of outrage crashed against Sheriff Harding's actions, with commentators condemning his aggression, his clear abuse of power, and the blatant disrespect shown at a soldier's funeral. Simultaneously, a tide of admiration swelled for General Sharma, for her composure under duress, her quiet dignity, and the sheer weight of her unheralded service. Stand with Sharma and Your Honor the uniform trended alongside Chak's disgraceful sheriff. But the digital landscape, as always, was a complex and often ugly terrain. Pockets of the internet, fueled by entrenched biases, rallied to Harding's defense. He was just doing his job, some argued. She looked out of place. How was he supposed to know? Others, more insidious, laced their comments with thinly veiled racist and sexist undertones, questioning Sharma's right to be there, her qualifications, her very Americanness. The raw, unvarnished prejudices of a divided nation were laid bare for all to see. Back in Havenwood, the fallout was immediate. The mayor's office was inundated with calls. The county commissioners convened an emergency meeting. Veterans organizations, from the local VFW post to national advocacy groups, issued scathing statements demanding a full and transparent investigation into Sheriff Harding's conduct. The pressure was immense, a relentless storm of public condemnation. Official statements began to trickle out, first from the county, then from state-level law enforcement agencies, and eventually, cautiously, from the Pentagon. They were, predictably, exercises in carefully worded neutrality, acknowledging an incident, promising a thorough review, and emphasizing a commitment to respect for all individuals, especially our service members. But beneath the anodyne language, the ground was shifting. No one in a position of authority could afford to ignore the sheer force of public opinion, nor the glaring disrespect shown to a two-star general. Throughout this maelstrom, General Sharma herself remained a figure of resolute silence. Reporters camped outside her temporary lodgings, hoping for a statement, a soundbite, any reaction at all. Her phone rang incessantly with requests for interviews from every major news outlet. She responded to none of them. Her silence was not an absence but a powerful presence. It amplified the voices of others, the veterans who spoke of her leadership, the colleagues who vouched for her character, the ordinary citizens who were simply appalled by what they had witnessed. Her refusal to engage in the media circus, to be drawn into the fray, only elevated her stature, transforming her from a participant in an ugly incident into an emblem of quiet strength and unwavering professionalism. The more Harding's supporters tried to paint her as an agitator or an anomaly, the more her dignified silence rebuked them, allowing the facts of her service and the ugliness of Harding's actions to speak for themselves with deafening clarity. While General Sharma maintained her dignified silence, the past of Sheriff Dale Harding began to unravel with alarming speed, each revelation adding another layer to the portrait of a man whose actions at the cemetery were not an isolated lapse in judgment but the culmination of a long-nurtured pattern of prejudice and abuse of power. The Internet, a relentless archaeologist, started excavating the buried histories of Havenwood. Stories previously whispered in hushed tones or dismissed as disgruntled complaints now found a national audience. A former female deputy, an African-American woman, recounted how Harding had consistently passed her over for promotion, citing vague concerns about her command presence, while less qualified white male officers advanced. Her formal complaints had been filed, investigated perfunctorily, and ultimately dismissed. An Asian American officer who had briefly served under Harding shared an experience where the sheriff had openly mocked his accent during a morning briefing, in front of all his colleagues. He'd transferred out of the department within 6 months. Old dispatch logs were unearthed, showing a disproportionate number of traffic stops and minor arrests, targeting minority communities in areas Harding personally patrolled. Internal emails, leaked anonymously, revealed Harding's resistance to diversity training initiatives, which he derisively referred to as political correctness gone mad. One particularly damning audio clip surfaced, purportedly from a closed-door meeting years earlier, in which a voice, identified by several former colleagues as Harding's, could be heard saying, "This town has traditions. We don't need outsiders coming in here telling us how to police our own, especially those who don't, fit the mold." The Klieg lights of media scrutiny were now firmly fixed on Harding, and he was wilting under their glare. His initial bluster had evaporated. He agreed to a televised interview, a desperate attempt to control the narrative, to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, a dedicated officer who had made an honest mistake in a high-pressure situation. The interview was a disaster. Seated opposite a seasoned, unflappable journalist, Harding appeared shifty and defensive. "I didn't see her rank. I didn't see her color," he insisted, his voice strained. "I saw an unknown individual in uniform acting suspiciously at a sensitive event. My training kicked in. I reacted instinctively to a perceived threat." The journalist pressed, but General Sharma was standing quietly, paying her respects. "Witnesses say you were the aggressor, Sheriff. You touched her. You challenged her. You unholstered your weapon." Harding stammered, It all happened so fast. You have to understand the pressure, the responsibility." His excuses rang hollow. His carefully constructed image of a tough but fair lawman crumbled with each evasive answer. The more he tried to justify his actions, the more he exposed the prejudice that lay beneath. Online, the reaction was immediate and brutal. The phrase, "I didn't see color," became a viral meme, a sarcastic shorthand for willful ignorance and blatant bias. Veterans, in particular, were incensed. "You don't see rank?" one retired sergeant major tweeted. "You feel it. You respect it. And if you can't tell the difference between a mourner and a threat, you have no business wearing that badge, let alone carrying a gun." The stark contrast between Harding's flustered, self-serving justifications and the enduring image of General Sharma's unwavering composure during the cemetery incident was not lost on anyone. Her silence continued to speak volumes, her dignity a silent rebuke to his desperate attempts at self-preservation. Each word Harding uttered in his defense only seemed to dig him into a deeper hole, further illuminating the chasm between his perception of himself and the ugly reality his actions had so starkly revealed. While Sheriff Harding floundered in the harsh glare of public scrutiny, a different kind of movement began to coalesce, one born not of anger or protest, but of a quiet, profound respect. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, within the ranks of the U.S. military, both active duty and veteran communities, spreading like an unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of something deeply significant. It wasn't organized. There were no calls to action, no planned demonstrations. Instead, it manifested in small individual acts that, collectively, created a powerful and undeniable statement. At Fort Bragg, a young specialist, after watching the news reports with a knot of anger in his stomach, printed a small official portrait of Major General Anya Sharma, her in full dress uniform, eyes clear and direct, and pinned it inside his locker next to a picture of his family. He didn't say anything to his bunkmates, but by the end of the day, 3 more pictures of the general had appeared in that barracks. Similar acts began to ripple across bases and VFW posts nationwide. A master sergeant in San Diego, a woman who had faced her own share of biases during her long career, replaced her generic desktop wallpaper with an image of General Sharma standing resolute at the Havenwood Cemetery, the very picture that had gone viral. During a morning color ceremony at a training facility in Texas, after the flag was raised and the anthem played, the commanding officer, a grizzled colonel, held his salute for an extra, almost imperceptible beat, his gaze distant, thoughtful. No words were exchanged, but everyone present understood the unspoken tribute. These quiet gestures soon evolved into something more visible, though still marked by a profound sense of decorum and restraint. One Saturday morning, a handful of cars, mostly driven by veterans and their families, began to gather in a supermarket parking lot on the outskirts of Havenwood. There was no fanfare, no shouted slogans. They had small American flags mounted on their antennas, and some had tied a simple strip of olive green fabric, the color of the Army dress uniform, to their side mirrors. As more cars arrived, a slow, solemn procession began to form. The line of vehicles, perhaps 50 or 60 strong by the time it set off, moved with a deliberate, almost funereal pace toward the center of Havenwood. They drove past the town square, past the war memorial, and then, with an almost imperceptible tightening of the unspoken formation, they turned onto the street where the Havenwood Sheriff's Department was located. Sheriff Harding, who had been holed up in his office, fielding angry calls and strategizing with his increasingly nervous deputies, heard the low rumble of engines first. He peered through the blinds. What he saw was not a mob, not an angry protest, but something far more unsettling. A silent parade of ordinary cars, driven by ordinary people, their faces somber, their purpose unspoken yet utterly clear. They weren't honking horns or waving signs. They were simply driving slowly, respectfully, their presence a quiet but overwhelming rebuke. As the procession passed the sheriff's office, some drivers, particularly those in military-style jeeps or trucks, executed a slow, deliberate salute as they went by, not a defiant gesture, but one of profound, almost mournful respect. Respect not for the building they were passing, but for the values its current occupant had so grievously violated. The olive green ribbons fluttered in the breeze, a stark reminder of General Sharma's uniform, of her service, of the honor that had been so casually threatened. The people of Havenwood, those who hadn't joined the procession, lined the sidewalks. They, too, were largely silent, watching with a mixture of awe, shame, and a dawning understanding. Some held their hands over their hearts as the cars passed. An elderly woman, tears streaming down her face, offered a tentative wave to a car driven by a young woman in an Army veteran cap. The young woman nodded back, a flicker of shared understanding passing between them. The parade of silent respect, as it later became known, lasted for nearly an hour. It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't aggressive, but its power was undeniable. It was a grassroots demonstration of solidarity, a collective expression of an ideal, that honor, service, and dignity transcend local politics and personal prejudice. It was a message delivered not through shouting, but through the quiet hum of engines, the somber faces of participants, and the simple, potent symbolism of a green ribbon. For Sheriff Harding, watching from his window, it must have felt like the slow, inexorable turning of a tide that was now decisively and silently running against him. The community and the wider military family had found its voice, and it was a voice that resonated with a power far greater than any official decree or angry denunciation. It was the sound of respect, quietly but firmly, reclaiming its ground. The silent parade, with its understated yet profound impact, marked a turning point. Sheriff Dale Harding, who had initially tried to weather the storm with bluster and deflection, found himself increasingly isolated. The official investigation into his conduct at the cemetery, initially a county-level affair, was now being closely monitored by state authorities, with persistent, unconfirmed rumors of federal interest, particularly given the involvement of a high-ranking military officer. The pressure, both public and institutional, was becoming unbearable. He was formally suspended from duty pending the outcome of the investigation. The announcement was made in a terse press release from the county manager's office, devoid of any expression of support for Harding. His badge and service weapon were collected. His access to the sheriff's department building was restricted. He was, for all intents and purposes, a man adrift, stripped of the authority that had defined him for so long. One cold, gray evening, as dusk settled over Havenwood, Harding found himself driving aimlessly at first, then with a dawning, reluctant purpose. His car, a nondescript sedan, eventually pulled up to the gates of the Havenwood Cemetery. He sat there for a long time, the engine idling, watching the shadows lengthen across the rows of silent sentinels. The place he had so arrogantly tried to dominate was now a stark reminder of his downfall. Finally, he cut the engine and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. He walked, not towards the main entrance, but along the perimeter fence until he reached a less visited section, the resting place of generations of Havenwood families. He located the relatively new headstone of Sergeant Marcus Cole. Nearby, though not immediately adjacent, was a simple, unadorned stone marking a plot that seemed, to his weary eyes, to represent something more abstract. Perhaps the grave of his own honor, or the dignity he had so carelessly trampled. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire career, Harding reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out his sheriff's badge, the polished metal glinting dully in the fading light. For a moment he just held it, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. Then slowly, he knelt, a gesture of unaccustomed humility, and carefully placed the badge at the base of Sergeant Cole's headstone. Next, he retrieved his service pistol, unloaded, the safety engaged. With equal deliberation, he laid it beside the badge. It wasn't an offering, not exactly. It felt more like a surrender, a relinquishing of symbols that no longer held any true meaning for him, or for anyone else, it seemed. He stayed there for a while, a solitary figure in the deepening gloom, lost in thoughts that offered no comfort. He didn't pray for forgiveness. He wasn't sure he deserved it or even knew how to ask for it. He just felt empty. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow ache of realization. As he finally rose to leave, his joints stiff, his spirit heavy, he noticed a figure standing a short distance away, partially obscured by the shadows of a large magnolia tree. His heart lurched. It was General Anya Sharma. She wasn't in uniform, just simple civilian clothes, her hands clasped behind her back. She had evidently been there for some time, a silent observer of his private, painful ritual. Their eyes met across the expanse of graves. Harding felt a flush of shame, a desperate urge to explain, to apologize, to somehow undo what he had done. But the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say? General Sharma offered no sign, no acknowledgement of his presence beyond that initial brief eye contact. No condemnation, no pity, not even curiosity. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer, a moment that stretched into an eternity for Harding. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn, she walked away, disappearing into the twilight. Her silence once again was more powerful than any words could have been. It wasn't a silence of anger, but of a profound, almost detached judgment. It left Harding standing alone, with the symbols of his lost authority lying on the cold granite, a testament to the steep, irrevocable price of prejudice and the enduring power of quiet dignity. He understood then that the truest consequences weren't always loud and public. Sometimes, they were a quiet internal reckoning, a solitary confrontation with the wreckage of one's own making. General Anya Sharma never publicly addressed the Havenwood incident. She didn't grant interviews, issue statements, or engage with the endless online commentary. True to her character, she quietly resumed her duties, her focus already shifted to the considerable responsibilities that awaited her. Yet the echoes of that day in the cemetery, and the silent strength she displayed, resonated far beyond the small southern town, subtly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to reshape conversations and perceptions within the institutions she served and the nation she defended. In the months that followed, small but significant changes began to appear. Training modules at military academies and law enforcement institutions saw quiet revisions. New scenarios were introduced focusing on de-escalation, implicit bias recognition, and the paramount importance of respecting rank and service regardless of an individual's appearance. The Havenwood incident, though not always explicitly named, became an unspoken case study, a powerful cautionary tale whispered in briefing rooms and debated in ethics seminars. One day, a simple, unadorned letter, bearing no official letterhead or signature, began to circulate through unofficial military channels, eventually finding its way onto secure online forums frequented by service members and veterans. It contained a single, powerful sentence. I chose silence, not because there was nothing to say, but so that the conscience of the errant might speak for itself. Truth needs no amplification when it is self-evident. Though its authorship was never confirmed, the voice, the sentiment, the quiet authority, it was unmistakably hers. The message didn't go viral in the traditional sense. It was absorbed, contemplated, and shared with a reverence usually reserved for foundational texts. Back in Havenwood, Sheriff Dale Harding's suspension became permanent. He quietly resigned, disappearing from public life, his name a byword for a particular kind of institutional blindness. The town, slowly, began to heal, though the memory of that day remained, a scar tissue reminder of vulnerabilities and, perhaps, of a newfound resilience. And what of General Sharma? She continued to serve as she always had, with dedication and an unwavering commitment to the ideals her uniform represented. The incident at Havenwood, while a painful chapter, ultimately served only to highlight the quiet strength and profound dignity that had defined her entire career. Her story, and the story of that day, is a complex tapestry woven with threads of prejudice, power, and the enduring strength of character. It reminds us that true honor isn't about the noise you make, but the principles you stand for, especially when standing alone. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful statements are made in silence, forcing us to confront not just the actions of others, but the reflections we see in our own societal mirrors. We'll continue to explore stories like these, stories that challenge us, that make us think, that reveal the often unseen battles for dignity and respect. Stories that, like General Sharma's, resonate long after the immediate events have passed. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on these vital narratives. Because understanding these moments, these confrontations, is crucial to understanding the world we live in. And as for General Sharma, it was later quietly revealed by a deeply trusted anonymous source within the Pentagon that the small, smooth river stone she'd clutched in her pocket that day at the cemetery, the one Sergeant Cole had given her years ago, wasn't just a memento. It was the same stone he'd carried through 3 tours in Vietnam, the one he said had saved his life more than once. Not through magic, but because holding it reminded him of who he was fighting to be, even in the deepest hell. She wasn't just holding a stone. She was holding a legacy, a promise, and a silent, unbreakable shield. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's why even a loaded gun couldn't make her flinch. After all, what's a bullet to a mountain?